Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Michael Heron. I'm the business unit leader for the central government division here in CGI. I'd just like to say thank you for everyone for joining. So in no particular order, Anthony, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Anthony Collard. I'm a vice president here in CGI in central government, and I've spent a long time working in and around government. Apparently, I'm a veteran of government, to which I thank Wendy very much for that terminology. Thank you, Wendy. Veteran makes me sound like I'm in my 90s.
Thank you, Anthony. Can we go, David? Are you with us yet? And Pamela, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello, thank you. I'm Pamela Cook. I'm the CEO of InfoShare. We're an SME, and I'll be here to talk about the role as both a CEO of SME and also as a member of the Small Business Advisory Panel with the Cabinet Office. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Nice to see the two hats that you're wearing there. Interested in both, Pamela, as we previously discussed, but your presence on that panel, I'm sure, will be very insightful for us. I'm going to pretend to be David for a while until he gets his technology sorted. David works for a firm called Celerius. They were the S part of an SME. David, in our preparation meeting yesterday, said they were now a M part of SME. So he's done terrifically well in his outfit, Celerius. They do work across government, both directly and with organisations such as CGI. So hopefully, if David can join, he's got some great insights to share as well. So I do hope between the four of us, we've got some different insights to share to really bring to life why we think this is such an important subject matter and the role it has to play within government. So if we just cover a tiny bit of intro about CGI as well. Those that are on the call, some of you might be aware of CGI. I can see some of the names, and we do have some clients on the call as well, but not everyone will know of us. But just a quick overview. So we're a global digital services firm. We're Canadian, we're headquartered in Canada. We've been around for 46 years. There's about 80,000 of us across 40 countries. So we're a global outfit, but we have a good presence in the UK. And from a government perspective, we do a lot of work across government here in the UK. We tend to be found in the upper part of what I call the IT layer cake. So think complex systems integration, apps dev, app support, advisory type work. We tend to run towards the quite complex and difficult things. We do a vast array of work, but certainly from everything down to the sea with some of the work that we do with Project Seagrass and using our satellite technology to identify the growth of seagrass, up to what we do in space with the European Space Agency as an example, and quite a bit in between. So we do a lot of work in what we call the mission. So think Crown Prosecution Service, MOJ, Home Office, policing, a lot of work in really quite mission critical places that make a difference on both society and citizens, and in citizen facing and affecting departments where we help ensure properties are correctly taxed. We ensure people who work with children have a DBS check. We do a lot of work with policing. If you've ever been on jury service and claimed your expenses, that will be our system that do that. We've also got involved in counting livestock and deer and sheep and other such livestock through our technology. So a lot of what we do, I hope, really does support, deliver policy within the government, and/or just really helps our citizens and citizens' experience, and also making our society a safer and better place. So that's CGI, but without further ado, if we can get on to the key topics, I'm going to start with an awkward question to all of the panel, that if you are in the unfortunate position of being stuck in a lift with me and you have to give an elevator pitch on why this subject matter of strengthening and supplying your IT supply chain was so important, and why you care about it so much, what would be that elevator pitch? And you have to pretend that you're in that lift for 30 seconds. Okay, so Pamela, can we start with you, please?
Well, I will start by doing a 15-second elevator pitch on InfoShare, and then 15 seconds, if I may, about why it's important to be able to work through the supply chain. So InfoShare, just by way of introduction, creates data foundations. We're a data management company, and we do that by installing software to create and maintain single views of people and places. In terms of why it's important to get the supply chain out, is we've beaten some of the largest companies in the world doing what we do in head to head, but getting that exposure across government is the biggest challenge we face. And yet SMEs like us have innovation, agility and ROI almost immediately that we're given an opportunity.
That's great, thank you, Pamela. David, do we have you yet?
Good afternoon. I hope you do have me. And
we do. Thank you.
Clearly, we're going to be stuck in the lift because of some sort of software failure or compatibility issue, which we've proved with this call so far. So 30 seconds, 15 seconds, first of all, on us, Celerius. So I'm the strategy director of Celerius. We call ourselves a digital transformation consultancy. Started off quite technical, and now we're full end-to-end. So we include technical architects, software engineers, delivery, business consulting, all that sort of stuff. And for us, similar to Pamela, I think it's about opening up opportunities and interesting projects for us. We have many projects where we work directly with central government and have worked alongside CGI in various forms, whether it be in functional teams or project teams or even rainbow type teams. But when we're looking at some of these big, new, interesting projects, the scale that we have simply won't allow us through the door, because potentially we don't have the right track record or we don't have the scalability. So some sort of partnering type opportunity with someone like CGI really can be good for us. And we really believe that we can bring something additional as well, that we have people that wouldn't necessarily want to work for one of the big players. And I'm sure the opposite is true. But we believe there's a real virtuous sort of mutual benefit out of these arrangements.
That's great. Thank you, David. And Anthony, your pitch, please.
I agree, both Pamela and David, I think. But I think beyond that, and the breadth and depth that SMEs can bring to any ecosystem and government delivery, I think it's also about government wanting to open the door to SMEs, and it's very hard for SMEs to be able to get a foot in the door when sometimes government procurement is really hard, really tortuous, can take a long time. And I speak as somebody who has run government procurements before, so you know how getting a much richer pitch, set of people on the pitch playing together gives much better value. I've seen that through deliveries I've done myself in government. You know, crucial that we do that kind of thing.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. And just in case I was stuck in a lift with myself, sounds like an awful experience, but I had to do my own pitch. I mean, from what I see, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but I do quite like the term that digital transformation is a symphony, not a solo. What does that mean? It means, back to Anthony's point, that I think clients get the best outcomes if they have a mixed and diverse ecosystem. I think, you know, different organizations have different talents. I think they all have something to bring to the table. The key skill, I think, that we can discuss later is how you orchestrate that and how you make that work, because that's easier said than done. But when it does work, it works really well. And you'll hear from us later that we're not shy to partner. We partner quite often. We don't think we can do everything, because we can't. And getting over that stigma first, I think, is crucial to a large organization like us, that not only can we not do everything ourselves, but the clients will benefit better if there is that diverse ecosystem available to them. And therefore, I think, you know, they get the outcomes that they want, better services for citizens. I think it helps the economy. I think it contributes to the levelling up agenda. And, at some point, David, I know we spoke about Silurius is now an M part of SME, but it used to be the S part of it. All SMEs need a foot through the door, and this is a proven good way to do that. Okay, let's unwrap that all a little bit more. So Pamela, can I come back to you? So as well as being the CEO of your company InfoShare,
Yeah.
as you said, you're also part of the Cabinet Office's Small Business Advisory Panel.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about that panel and its objectives?
Yeah, so it was set up under David Cameron's government with the initial objective of 25% of government spend going via SMEs, both indirect and direct. And the role of the panel very much is to provide scrutiny, feedback and challenge to the government on its SME policy. And it does get listened to. It's made up of, I think it's 25 SME owners, as well as representation from trade and industry bodies. And we meet regularly. We meet and engage with ministers as well. We sit on working groups that range from net zero to social value, supply diversity, routes to market, and where we are the voice of small business directly into government. Recent example is probably the procurement bill, which will introduce a whole new regime for public sector procurement. And just before Christmas, members attended an SME roundtable with Baroness Neville Roll from the House of Lords for input into the bill in terms of benefits to SMEs and overcoming some of the more traditional obstacles. We also contribute to government playbooks, so sourcing, consultancy, digital data technology, and of course, they're used across government for policy procurement and commercial teams. So we make sure, as part of our engagement with that, alongside companies like CGI, that the SME community needs are being reflected in those playbooks. And successes have involved improvement in payment terms, so prompt payments. And also we've seen an increase in departmental spend to SMEs. And I think a lot of that is unlocking the understanding and breaking down that fear of working with the smaller entities, again, both directly and indirectly. But there's still a long way to go. And there's still a lot of holding feet to the fire required. And it is an uphill challenge.
Mm-hmm. And although the title of the panel is an advisory panel, you've just given some examples there where said advice has turned into either government guidance, or hopefully in some cases, if the procurement bill goes through both the Lords and the Commons and gets royal assent, will indeed turn into policy as well. So you have hope that you're not just advising, you can see some doing as well.
Yes, and we've seen a lot of examples of that actually, Michael, not least the prompt payment. That was a massive undertaking, and I chaired the working group on that when it was first launched, but also the social value as well. We were able to influence a lot of that because unless you've been in that SME environment, you don't understand the restrictions, limitations, or indeed the opportunities that the SMEs can present. And SMEs represent 50% of the workforce in the UK. So it's really important that that voice is heard and understood through all of those procurements and opportunities.
Yeah, and you must have seen a lot, Pamela, in your time on that panel. If you did have a magic wand, what would you want government or maybe even industry to do or to change? Have you got a particular frustration out there or barrier that you think could make a huge difference if something happened?
Well, I think there's two answers to that actually, Michael. The first will be if we're looking at direct, so putting the ecosystem to one side for a moment. In a recent poll of several hundred SMEs, only 4% have a bid writer. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge undertaking in itself. And 55% of them had found the qualifications for the thresholds too high, and 44% found the complexity too high, too much for them to be able to dedicate their resource to it. And of course, then you've got the disproportionate risks that flow down. So I think if I had a magic wand, it would be that the ecosystems that strategic suppliers the government should set up are actually running well and effectively, and they're not just a statement, but they're actually reflected in reality in the way that a recent experience with CGI's ecosystem that my company has had, where it is really partnership and it is really opportunities, and it takes away some of those pains that we have when trying to go direct. So I think the combination of those two would be the magic wand, where
Yeah.
there's less of one and more of the other.
Yeah, that's fascinating, especially to have those statistics. You can see what the real barriers are there. Let's jig this up a bit. So everybody on the call that's listening, feel free to carry on listening. But if you'd like to ask questions, either put your hand up or put it in the chat. Because as a facilitator, I'll try and ask the most intelligent questions I can, but you'll all be thinking stuff as well. So let's make this as interactive as possible. On that point, let's bring Anthony in then. So Anthony, that must ring bells with you about the ingredients that work well and what's required. When Pamela was talking about the ecosystem, and it's probably quite easy to write down what it looks like on paper, but in practice, it's got to be more than just about targets. It's got to be about relationships and how the organisations work together.
I think that's supremely important. I think culture and cultural fit and willingness to work as partners is absolutely crucial. We've built 2 ecosystems for government, and CGI has worked with many partners on gigs for a long time. But within these 2 big ecosystems we built, what we're trying to do is be very open about the work that we can see coming, be very honest that we can't do everything. So on one of the ecosystems we've got, CGI doesn't have a particular type of capability. It's absolutely going to come from an SME ecosystem who've got that capability. Those are the conversations we've been having with Pamela. It's not the challenge then is we share the challenge of working with government to actually get that work to come through the pipeline in the first place, but actually we can share that challenge. It's not for an SME to be able to do it, but cultural fit, working together, being partners is absolutely important. Having an honest conversation as well, because things don't always go well. Government is hard to work in. I speak as somebody who did 30 years there. Priorities change. No one saw Brexit coming in 2016, and no one saw the pandemic, and all of a sudden all priorities go out the window and you just do something different. So you need to be able to have a conversation and say, right, that piece of work isn't going to happen because of X, but now we've got this one. How do you fancy playing? And giving those people the opportunity to say, well, actually, I think we've got that capability is really, really important. I think there's a little bit then about fit in terms of skills and capabilities. The things that Pamela and David have been talking about are things that CGI does a little bit of, but they might be experts in. So can they complement it? Do we then bring a breadth and depth to the government partner that we've got? Our ambition is that whenever we win work with government with an ecosystem in it, we can address any of their needs, and that's massively at the heart of one of the big ecosystems that we won in government recently. So it is cultural fit and complementary skills. Blend those 2 things together, and any demand that government needs at any given time should come from that ecosystem. But I think the most important bit is that you get on. Okay, you've got the same goals and background, whether that's commitment to social value, whether that's the way in which you want to work. Those things are crucial. If you get on, you can actually have a conversation, a relationship. That ecosystem will work. If you treat an SME supplier as just somebody you dole work out to when you can't do it yourself, and you keep information to yourself, that's not a supplier relationship as I would want to have. Pamela's waving at me.
Yeah, come on in, Pamela.
Well, I just think another point, and I've just sort of considered this, is I love the fact that CGI, for example, is creating a very strong, robust ecosystem, and a couple of other strategic suppliers to government are, but others are claiming it. But I think a switch needs to be perhaps given as well to the procurement leads of the departments to actually ask those questions of the strategic suppliers, show the evidence of those ecosystems. What do they look like? Where are the figures? So we're getting, one of the wins we had was getting each of the departments to publish their SME spends, but we don't have that from the strategic suppliers. So is it lip service, or is it a real thing? What efforts are you actually making to engage SMEs and looking beyond the comfort of the current partners?
That's key, isn't it? So I guess that can only be understood through the partnerships and relationships piece that Anthony says, or measurement. We have quite a famous term in CGI that if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get done. So we can absolutely relate to that. Because Anthony, with your previous hat on of your 30 years in the civil service, you must have had hundreds of suppliers knocking on your door, telling them what great partners they were and how they work with others. And you probably had to quite quickly form a judgment about whether they're just saying that or whether they're doing that. And David, you must have had several systems integrators come up to you and say what great partners they are, only for you to be let down, perhaps, that it was full of empty promises. So, David, how do you maybe I'm wrong, but have you had lots of those sort of conversations? And if so, how do you judge who are the ones that actually mean it?
So certainly we've certainly had good and bad partners, and how we judge it before the event, I think, is very hard to do. I think it's actually, it's only in the course of actually trying to build up that relationship that you see whether it's working or not. But I'd certainly echo what Anthony has said, that for us, I think it's very much about the relationship and having a proper partnership where we clearly see that you, in this case, CGI, can help us, can give us something that we wouldn't otherwise have access to, some projects we wouldn't otherwise have access to, but also recognition on your side that we can do stuff, and we maybe have people and resources and skills that you don't have. And that trust relationship, I think, is really important. It's not about a very detailed contract between us that says that every third resource requirement will get doled out to us or anything like that, because in my experience that doesn't work, because the nature of things changes, and also just because the third requirement that comes along, we may not be the best placed person or company to fulfill that. So that doesn't work for anyone. So I think we favour the relationships where there's a nice simple contract and we actually make it work through mutual benefit for both sides. And in the case of CGI, actually, I mean, I think we built that relationship before we were talking about supplier ecosystems. We hadn't given it a name in those days. We just happened to be working together, and it was working quite well. And that we've sort of built into this slightly more formal supplier ecosystem or strategic delivery partner type relationship. I see Pamela just raising a hand, but there's just one other point I was just going to bring just whilst it's fresh in my mind. Otherwise, I will forget. I apologise. But we were talking a bit about skills. And I think from our perspective, sometimes the skills that we can bring as an SME aren't quite as obviously defined as they would be in a big project procurement exercise. So you might be asking for someone who has a track record working with the MOD, or has experience in something else, something specific. Whereas our experience might be in something a little bit more subtle, that we have happened to have built up a niche in case management systems, or we happen to have built a niche in legacy transfer. And these aren't necessarily things that get to the top of a requirements list, but the reality is, in a bigger team, it can be really useful.
Yeah, good points, David. Pamela, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I think this is it's really important as well to recognise that it's not just a one-way street, and expecting a strategic supplier like CGI to come to the SMEs and say, this is what we've got, what can you do? Because actually the way that I first got introduced to CGI was I had an idea that I brought to CGI and said, this is what I think we could do. Would you be able to sort of prime it, wrap around and represent it? Because it's all very well, relying on you guys, but we're the ones that have to be innovative, and we have to fight for that business. And because we're looking at it from a slightly different perspective, which is probably part of the overall plan, I think it's important to recognise it's a mutual two-way. And what I've loved about the ecosystem approach is that it is more, as Anthony said, a partnership. So I remember getting around a table very, very early days with CGI and just sort of running that idea around and being treated as an equal, and not being treated as somebody that's come in with this crazy woman with an idea. And I think it's important to make it two-way. But equally, the strategic suppliers have got to have a team that can cope with that as well, so it doesn't become overwhelming.
Yes. Okay.
Hi there. Just cutting in a second there. I can see that we've got a question from Scott Larden, who had his hand up. Scott, you've taken your hand back down. Is your question still relevant?
No, it is. Pamela was actually just in the process of actually answering a big part of my question, but I wouldn't mind just going a bit deeper. It's definitely one for yourself, Pamela, and yourself, David. I mean, Now, CGI clearly prides itself in authentically adopting the spirit of what government started about embracing SMEs and running an SME agenda. And I do truly think that we are authentic in that. And Pamela, I liked your analogy about it being, a two-way street, not a one-way street. I just wondered whether your experience is common across industry. Do you think the rest of industry is truly adopting and embracing the SME agenda in the truest of spirits, or is it still a means to an end for some people? It'd just like your opinion on that, really.
I think it's a really good question, and I've got to be a little harsh on this one, Scott, but being very brutal, I think a lot of it is lip service still at the moment. So there are, we, as part of the advisory panel, I set up a working group which I chaired around doing a deep dive into some of the strategic suppliers and what they were really doing with SMEs. And it was quite shocking what we found. So what they were declaring on their responses to tenders was very different to the reality of what we found on the ground. So I think there's still a huge amount of work to be done. And I think this is why I think government procurement teams need to really push back and ask for the evidence and see, is it really happening, or are they just sort of have they just given us a great cover? That's my experience. David, you may have a very different experience.
Well, Pamela, I mean, I think you have a much broader view than I do because of your work on the panel and things. But just speaking from, all I can speak of is from my own Solarius experience, and so I don't think it's common across the market as a whole. We do have relationships with other big suppliers, and I think they're slightly different in nature. And we've also got some bad experiences where we have been involved, on one occasion actually, where we were on a framework and one of the big suppliers wasn't. We joint bid with them because they didn't actually happen to have access to that framework, although they were much bigger than us. And subsequently, actually, it's we feel like we're getting pushed out of a lot of stuff, and so it doesn't always work. And I do think there's a bit of lip service in there, certainly.
Okay, thank you both. Right, let's try and get practical on this. So when we talk about, we've mentioned ecosystems quite a bit so far. Let's bring that to life a little bit for the audience about what that means, and how it works in practice. So Anthony, could you start just talking a little bit about CGI's ecosystems and how it began, how it works as well in practice, so that those on the call can operationalize a little bit about how it's actually working.
Yeah, sure. So as I say, we've got two big ones at the moment, very much led by, I guess, the initial requirement from government was to pass work through to SMEs, and there's different ways in which you can do that. You can just have a very causal relationship where you pass one role down, another role down. What we decided to do for one of our big contracts was to create a whole panel of SMEs who work together and get them together. We socialise together. I've got bad memories of an evening at cricket, for example, where maybe there was an old glass of wine involved. But we pull those ecosystem people together based upon what we've talked about before, and they're part of, effectively, the team. We have one team. It is this particular contract, I won't say what it's called. We engage with the client, so we've done a lot of the bid work ourselves, but we've had support from the ecosystem partners in putting that bid together. And then as work is coming down the pipe from the client, and we're getting that client view, we're sharing that with that ecosystem as it comes through, and giving people the opportunity to say, actually, we've got that capability right now, and we can deliver it, whatever that capability might be. And it's given the client access to a huge breadth of skills that they haven't always had. Let's be honest, this is a really tight technology market at the moment. It's, we've all got pressure on rates. Government wants us to be doing things competitively. None of us have a bench to speak of, but we all have bits of benches. And when you put those benches together, you've got what government needs. So, if you take the case of this particular client, without speaking about it too much, 50% of the roles, and we've got 100 people on the ground in this particular client, 50% of the roles with SME ecosystem partners. and some of the people that are working in there are real niche skills that we simply don't have in CGI, and actually other partners of that government department couldn't find them either, but the SME ecosystem did, and they are now on the ground doing great work and viewed as a partnership. And that work is ongoing, and then the brunt of the paperwork is picked up by my core teams, so getting the statements of work prepared, but working in conjunction with the SME, particularly if there are any flow down of some of the terms that are required, because often government wants outcome based. And then the teams are delivered, and we keep monitoring that together, and the revenue is shared and payments are made, and everyone kind of gets a good hint of the work. But the best bit for the client and for the citizen is they get a much better service. Government can come to you and say, I want 40 of this type of thing in about 3 weeks, please. Well, no one's got that, but together we can. And that's how it works. And that's how it works in the other space as well. Almost exactly the same kind of approach. Very open. This is the work coming down. Who can do it?
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. Pamela, your reflections on that, certainly with the hat that you wear on the Small Business Advisory Panel, what's your reflections of what Anthony's just said in terms of how it's working in practice and how it works both for government and for SMEs?
I think if each strategic supplier to government was able to take that approach, it would increase the indirect spend to government beyond their targets, and it would give SMEs a real boost in the levelling up agenda, in the economy generally, and the ministerial oversight, which sort of looks at the SME action plans, would really go hand in hand with the direct and the indirect spends, and I think that would see a real boost. I think it would be a real example of how to do it well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and David, tell us about it from the other side, if you like. So, as an active partner in one of those ecosystems, what's your experience of it, and what's the ingredients that you think makes it work?
So, I mean, one of the things I was going to say was it's not always perfect and it doesn't always work, but actually in a just a realistic way that so I've said, and as Anthony has described, that is exactly the way that we've seen it. There will be requests come out for resources, and sometimes we can fulfill them and sometimes we can't. But also sometimes we'll be going back to whoever our main contact is relating to that particular project in CGI and saying, God, this is a bit of a joke, isn't it? Someone with SC clearance, MPPV3, inside IR35, specialist architect for £300 a month. You're not going to find that. So sometimes there is a bit of a tension, and so the fact that I've said that we have a proper trust relationship is exactly about having those conversations sometimes, and sometimes we are going to be pushing back. So, but I think that's healthy. That's the way it should be working. And overall, I still think it leads to, if that works, it creates a natural balance, and you have a proper sort of market economy almost, which hopefully gives the best benefit to central government and then back to us as taxpayers.
Yeah. Okay. And then Anthony, from your lens, I guess it's not always that straightforward, or it's easier said than done from our perspective as a systems integrator. So likewise, just as Pamela was commenting that there are several large suppliers out there that say the right things but don't always do the right things, I seem to recall when we were forming our ecosystems that you had a lot of people with a lot of interest knocking on your door, but some of them came to the table and some of them didn't. Talk a little bit about that, because that's around the formation of the ecosystem, and we've landed in a place where it works, and it's based on the relationships that David said, but it took some time to form it because you had a lot of interest, didn't you? But not all of that interest ended up in the ecosystem.
No, and at the moment you win any contract in government, obviously there's a lot of interest in it and being involved in it, and I had lots of conversations with lots of people. And I think there are a number of reasons why sometimes that ecosystem partnership won't work with a particular supplier or not. Some of it is about government. So, you won't get me here to say a bad word about working in government, a civil service for 30 years. I enjoyed every single minute of it. But it has its challenges, and some of those challenges do flow out into that ecosystem. So sometimes, even if we've got the best of intentions, as Pamela well knows, we could be running alongside an opportunity we think is going to happen for a year, and suddenly they just change direction on the drop of a hat. But actually, and so people who understand that and that process get much more fulfillment out of an ecosystem over a longer term, because you realise actually you're in for the long haul, and you're working for that long haul. So when people come, some of them want to work in a particular way, and sometimes that's not possible. Some of the ecosystem partnerships we've been able to form is because we're trying to react to the requirements on the contract are so broad that they could be anything from a one-person resource to have multiple teams. And if you've got a supplier, whether an ecosystem supplier that only wants to deliver full teams all the time, then naturally some of the roles where it's one or two here and there is not going to work for them, and they're not going to be able to participate as they would like to, and that's perfectly acceptable. That's absolutely their choice. Equally, there are some who only ever want to do ones and twos, so if it all ever becomes about teams and that's not their bandwidth, they won't be able to play. But I think so long as you can have that open conversation about the work that you're seeing, you can kind of get through that. But it is a two-way street, as you said. All SIs, whether they're doing it properly or not, will be investing a lot of time, money, and investment in that ecosystem. We do it, or certainly in my space, I do it a lot because I think it adds real value and strength, not just in the delivery that you're in the middle of, but also into future bidding. Because you can sit there and say, this is what we do. And as government moves more into it, understands how it works, it becomes a really powerful differentiator in the market. But the bottom line is sometimes it's just not going to work. And if all an SME ecosystem partner is going to do is just turn up at a meeting, never contribute, never act as a critical friend. I like the fact that sometimes Pamela holds me to account about what's going on here. That's great. Let's be a critical friend. It can't just be passive in one way. And sometimes those passive relationships don't quite work out. You can't kind of cling on the coattails and then grab the nice stuff. This should be a two-way partnership. As Pamela and David said, bringing stuff to us as much as we're bringing it to you. That those kind of relationships make it work. Whether it doesn't work like that, then I think it's just not going to be for sort of the future. And you sort of get a vibe very much for those relationships that are going to work long haul and those that aren't. And I very much view it as a long haul. Some of these contracts are 3, 4, 5 years, and I expect a lot of it to materialize in years 2, 3, 4, and 5, not in month 6 while the client's getting their head around it.
Pamela, do you have a point?
Yeah, that's just triggered a reminder in my brain. So several years ago, I was asked to chair a meeting at number 10, and it was all around trying to reach out to strategic suppliers to government to embrace SMEs. This is before the ecosystems were really a thing, so it's going back that long. And what was really interesting was the only people that turned up were the procurement people within the strategic suppliers. But ultimately, in my experience, and Michael, I can stand to be corrected on this, they're not the ones that ultimately make the decision about the partners. And they came along because of where the meeting was, and they thought it was a sort of a good exposure, and it was. But the people that made the decisions ultimately were not the ones that turned up. So I think maybe that's a communication issue for government through their strategic suppliers. Say, how are you doing it? It's not just about procurement, it's about engaging the commercial teams and understanding what is required and how to get it. So whether there's a step change required there or not, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. If you any more questions from the floor, keep them coming or put in the chat. Thank you, Guy Wolfenden, for your comment. Michael's symphony analogy is very true, and getting it to sound beautiful takes real effort by all parties, regularly checking in with each other to make sure we are on track and doing and deciding together. We even run training programs together with Celerius, helping our people to learn and to develop together, as well as doing their day jobs. Okay, thank you. Now, Anthony, with your previous hat on, having worked in government for 30 years, if we had some procurement officers in government departments on the call now, or if they listen to the webinar later on, if they said to you, oh, it sounds good, but that sounds really quite complex to transact and to contract for, and then to govern it when you're in contract sounds easier said than done. What advice would you have there, Anthony?
Two things, I guess. First of all, as it's far harder in a nice way. It's far harder dealing with 100 SMEs as a large government supplier than it is dealing with one company that's bringing those SMEs under the umbrella. It's harder for the SMEs for all the reasons that David and Pamela spoke about in terms of bid writing and the effort to go on to procurement frameworks and then take a punt that you're going to win 1 in 10 DOS opportunities. And it's far harder for the government supplier as buyer to actually keep up with those SMEs. One of the biggest challenges, and I said this, I know, on a blog on LinkedIn, was when I was in a particular position in Gov, I had SMEs knocking on the door all the time, but my diary was always full. So you then almost randomly end up chatting to ones who are the most persistent, or maybe the ones who are the most interesting. But it is like throwing mud at the wall as to whether that's going to work for them as much as it is going to work for you. And so, creating these ecosystems as part of procurement is a really positive way forward, because in reality, all of the work to bring that ecosystem together, to look after it, to make sure that the companies involved in it are solvent and are going to meet all the rules around right to work in the UK and all that kind of stuff, fall on the supplier ecosystem. So the paperwork around it is minimal in terms of government. There's a bit about monitoring and are you doing the right things, but all the commercial issues fall on our side as the SME and partnership. There's absolutely very little paperwork in doing it that way, and so I don't see there as a downside at all, other than as Pamela said, sometimes it's lip service, and I think perhaps one of the things that doesn't happen as much as it should do is proper credit given through procurement where things are actually happening on the ground rather than just on a bit of paper. That doesn't happen as much as perhaps it should do, and it should be a thing.
Okay, thank you. And Pamela, before we move to any further Q&A, what advice would you give any central government departments that are continually considering how best to bring SMEs into their ecosystem?
I think it would be very simple, is to have those conversations with the strategic suppliers that they're working with, to ask them about that and to challenge their ecosystem and ask for examples of that, to continually hold their feet to the fire. I think would make a huge difference. Even the thinking then of some of those that don't have a good ecosystem, maybe that could spur them on.
Thank you. And David, same question to you. What advice would you give central government departments who are looking at how to bring more SMEs into their space?
Well, I mean, I would assume that the admin effort of dealing with one organisation, whether they're a small organisation or a big organisation, is broadly the same. So, and as I think we're all very familiar with procurement activities in government, and having almost sat on the other side of the table, I know that the mental effort that goes into trying to decide whether a supplier is going to fulfill on what they're promising. And I do think there's a natural instinct to go for bigger suppliers just because the risk is lower. You're taking a bit of a punt if there's this little specialist organisation that comes along and says, we're great, we've done this, but maybe we don't quite have the track record that you want, but aren't we great? And, I just think that it's a risk element, which potentially going through a bigger partner, and I hate to say this because I'd love them to come direct to us in many ways, but if our only way to get onto some of these projects is to work through a partner, I'm absolutely for it. And it potentially it opens up the door to many more suppliers that otherwise would potentially be regarded as too high risk, and certainly would potentially be regarded as not being scalable or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Please type in your questions or put up your hands, and Wendy will bring you in. I don't have that power, I'm afraid, but Wendy will help facilitate that. Whilst you're thinking of any final questions, let me just ask my final one. So we've gone through the concept, we've gone through the practicalities of what it looks like. Let's go to the future. So what would the future look like for you? So 10 years time, when we're talking about this topic in 10 years time, what's your vision of what that might look like? What should we all be collectively aspiring to? It's a loaded question, but Pamela, I'm sure your passion for the topic, I'd love to hear your vision.
Well, I think, it's reasonable to expect that if we're all signed up to recognising the importance of SMEs and the 50% of the people being employed by SMEs, that I wouldn't expect 50% of the spend to go there, but I think a real robust improvement on where the spend is now and real robust engagement would mean that it was almost second nature to look at the SMEs and include them in all of the thought processes, and making the transparency not just of the individual departments, but also of the strategic suppliers to government, the transparency of their pipelines and their spend, again, second nature.
Yeah, that's very, very thoughtful observation, and makes me think that that could and should be a reality in time. I don't see why that couldn't happen. David, what would be your vision about what the future looks like in this space?
I don't know whether my vision's realistic or not, but I think it would be about the way that procurement happens. And I think things go in phases a bit. And obviously we have lots of rules around procurement, a way that they work at the moment to ensure accountability and sort of clear decision making and good due diligence and all these sorts of things. But I do think that it sometimes puts us in a position, and I say us, I mean the country almost, you know, where we're procuring based on going through a process which doesn't necessarily get the best balance of suppliers. So I guess I would hope for a tendency towards slightly more open procurement that really does embrace a range of suppliers. Maybe even things like the dreaded IR35 would be relaxed to, you know, because I think a lot of the people that we want to work with are sort of small businesses that IR35 is a killer for them, but they're effectively, you know, just they're really useful resources, and it's a bar, as well as, I suppose, getting the unimaginable perfect foresight of project requirements and no changes in scope and all those things. But I think I may have gone off into the world.
Good Lord, that's very visionary, David. Stop that. Clear scope, clear requirements. Goodness me. But yes, good thoughts. Thank you. And Anthony, to finish off then, so, you know, 30 years as a senior civil servant, and 30 years I understand that you want to do in CGI as well. So thanks. Thank you. What does good look like in the future here, Anthony, in this space?
Good looks like not being called a veteran in the future, I think, Michael. So two things. So, you know, one of my former employers in government was somebody responsible for tax. So I'm not going to go anywhere near the IR35 question that David decided to pick a fight with. I think whatever that is fine by me. Obviously, I hope the ecosystem thing is working much better than it is. I hope there are more SMEs in government. I think the interesting bit for me coming out of government into the commercial world was realizing the consequences of decisions that get taken in government that perhaps impact the private sector. And I do wonder if some of that is because government, by and large, is used to dealing with some of the larger organisations, and so not necessarily having to worry about the consequences of some of the things and their decision making. So I'd like to see a little bit more commercial awareness in the projects and programmes in Gov who are commissioning work. And to understand the impacts of their decisions. You know, we have seen a few opportunities where, you know, we've got to the point where we've got SMEs and resources ready, lined up. They've got a bench ready. They're waiting for this to work. We're expecting that work to come, and then at the drop of a hat, that piece of work is pulled. And there are obviously reasons why that happens. Totally get that, but you know, an SME. And even a larger supplier like us can't afford to have 10, 7, 8, 12 people sat on a bench for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, hoping for it, and then it not happening. You know, that's a lot of revenue for those kind of people. And that's just one kind of example where you see some of those commercial consequences of decisions that aren't thought through. You know, and there's no fault of people in government. I was one of them. You know, you work in these really pressured environments, and you make the decision based upon the information in front of you. But actually, you know, you should be thinking about impacts of those decisions collectively around the piece. So, you know, greater commercial awareness at the decision-making point in those sort of delivery arms, I think would be really, really helpful, so that you can have these conversations and say, look, we can do this in a different way, and enabling us to be that critical friend to Gov would be great. So there you go.
Okay, right. Before I wrap up and say thank you, I'm minded to let everybody have a little bit of time to go and get a cup of tea before their next meeting. But Wendy, can we just check? Are there any further questions that have come in?
No, there's been no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Then may I say thank you to our three guests today, Pamela, Anthony, and David. We'll give you a virtual clap for that. Thank you very much. You've all brought something very different to the table, but also common areas of consideration. So I hope that whatever your role is on the call, if you're listening, whether you're a supplier or a government department, even if you've just taken one nugget away from this webinar, then I hope that's of benefit to you and your organisation. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Wendy, I think we'll close the call. Thanks, everyone.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.